Somewhere in Upper Egypt, a monastery built from sand-colored stone and centuries of silence held a document that should not have been there. It was found in the early 1900s. The exact year remains disputed, tucked among Coptic liturgical manuscripts in a monastic archive that had been sealed, cataloged, and largely ignored by Western scholars for generations. The fragment was small, perhaps half a folio page, written in Latin on vellum that had darkened unevenly with age. Its edges were damaged, its ink faded in places to a pale rust. But what made it remarkable was not its condition. It was what it carried. Pressed into the margin of the document were partial seal impressions, wax remnants bearing imagery consistent with, though not identical to, the seals used by the Knights Templar during the height of their power in the Levant. The text itself was rendered in a cipher, not a known Templar cipher, not any cipher system that has been matched to Western medieval military correspondence. Something else, a system that to this day has never been fully broken. The monastery's own records offer no explanation. There is no catalog entry noting the fragment's arrival, no letter of donation, no mention of Frankish visitors, Templar envoys, or Latin-speaking contacts at any point in the monastery's long and carefully documented history. The document simply exists within the collection, as though it had always been there, or as though someone ensured its presence would go unquestioned. 3 scholars examined the fragment during the 20th century. One dated it to roughly 1280, placing it within the final years of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. As another argued, it could not have been produced before the 1320s, more than a decade after the Templar Order was officially dissolved. The third declined to offer a date at all. No consensus was reached, no follow-up study was published, and the question the fragment first raised, why a Templar-adjacent document was sealed inside an Egyptian Christian archive with no record of contact, has never been answered. The gap between what we're told and what remains. The story, as most people learn it, is remarkably tidy. A small group of knights founded a religious military order around 1119. They set up headquarters on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They grew powerful, grew wealthy, grew dangerous, and in 1312, a papal decree dissolved them, beginning, middle, end. A clean arc, perhaps suspiciously clean, for an institution that operated across multiple continents for nearly 2 centuries. This is the version that survives in popular history, in documentaries, in encyclopedia entries trimmed to fit a paragraph. And it holds together perfectly well, so long as you do not ask where the story actually comes from, because the Templars' own records are gone, not misplaced, not scattered across obscure archives, waiting for a diligent researcher. The order's internal documentation, its governance records, grounds, its correspondence between commanderies, its financial ledgers, its chapter general proceedings, the written architecture of an organization that managed thousands of properties across Europe and the Near East was almost entirely destroyed. What remains of the Templar story has been reconstructed from the outside, from the accounts of chroniclers who were not members, from papal bulls that define the order's legal status without describing its inner life, and most extensively from the transcripts of the very trials that were designed to annihilate it. This means the dominant historical narrative of the Knights Templar is built almost exclusively from the words of people who were either indifferent to the order or actively hostile toward it. The Templars themselves, as a documentary voice, are nearly silent. Historians have long acknowledged this void, but acknowledging it and reckoning with its implications are different acts. A destroyed archive is not simply missing information. It is a decision. Someone chose destruction over preservation. When someone examined those records and determined that their contents were more dangerous intact than absent, the question no official history has adequately addressed is not what was destroyed. It is who decided what to keep. Ask where the Templars operated, and the answer comes quickly. Jerusalem, the Levant, the fortified coastline of the Crusader states. Ask where they fought, and the list extends across the Holy Land like a litany of dust and stone. But ask about Egypt, and the conversation tends to stall, not because the connection is absent, because it has never been properly centered. Egypt was not peripheral to the Crusader world. It was the gravitational center that shaped nearly every major strategic decision of the 12th and 13th centuries. The Fifth Crusade did not march toward Jerusalem. It invaded Damietta, pushing deep into the Nile Delta in a campaign that was as catastrophic as it was revealing. The Templars were there not as reluctant participants, but as central military actors, commanders who moved through Egyptian territory with a confidence that the broader Crusader leadership conspicuously lacked. Decades later, when King Louis IX of France was captured during his own Egyptian campaign, it was Templar financial infrastructure that arranged his ransom. Templar agents negotiated directly with the Mamluk court. Templar ships moved goods and gold through Egyptian waters. These were not incidental contacts. They were sustained. Operational relationships that required detailed knowledge of ports, river systems, and inland routes, knowledge that does not appear in any surviving account of how the order gathered its intelligence. And beneath the military engagements, largely invisible to the chronicles, ran the trade. Shipping records from Acre and Tyre reveal the movement of Egyptian origin goods through Templar-connected channels, papyrus, mineral pigments, materials with no origin point in the Levant. The commerce was quiet, steady, and older than the wars it outlasted. Yet in the standard telling, Egypt remains a backdrop, a place the Crusaders occasionally stumbled into and retreated from, never the destination, never the point, which raises a question the conventional narrative prefers not to frame. What exactly did the Templars understand about Egypt that the histories have declined to explore? The story begins with 9 men and a claim that does not survive contact with its own details. Around 1119, a French knight named Hugues de Payens arrived in Jerusalem with 8 companions and petitioned King Baldwin II for permission to establish a new religious order. Their stated mission was the protection of Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads between the coast and the Holy City. The king granted them quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, built atop the ruins of what was believed to be Solomon's Temple. And there, according to the official account, the 9 knights remained for approximately 9 years. 9 men guarding hundreds of miles of bandit-plagued roads for 9 years. The arithmetic alone strains belief. But the deeper problem is not the implausibility of the mission. It is the absence of any evidence that the mission was carried out. No contemporary chronicle record the 9 founders escorting a single pilgrim, and no traveler's account mentions their protection. No incident report, no complaint, no letter of thanks survives from the entire period of their supposed guardianship. They were stationed on one of the most significant religious sites on earth, and for nearly a decade, they appear to have done nothing visible. What they may have done, however, was dig. In the 19th century, British engineer Charles Warren conducted excavations beneath the Temple Mount and discovered tunnels running directly below the platform where the Templars had been quartered. Inside those tunnels, his team recovered artifacts unmistakably linked to the medieval order, a spur, sword fragments, a small cross bearing Templar insignia. The physical evidence confirmed what the documentary silence had long suggested. The founders had been active underground, in passages giving them private access to chambers predating the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. If the nine were not guarding pilgrims, they were searching for something beneath the most archaeologically layered site in the ancient world. Whether they found it is a question the official record does not answer, but everything that happened next suggests they did. What followed those 9 silent years is, by any historical measure, extraordinary. Hugues de Payens returned to Europe around 1129. Within a remarkably short span, the order he led received formal endorsement from the Council of Troyes, was granted a papal rule, authored under the direct influence of Bernard of Clairvaux, and began attracting donations of land, money, and manpower from virtually every noble family in Western Christendom. Within a single generation, the Templars went from 9 obscure men living in a borrowed mosque to one of the wealthiest and most politically insulated institutions in the medieval world. This trajectory has no parallel. Other military orders existed. The Hospitallers preceded the Templars in Jerusalem by decades and had a well-established reputation for charitable work. Yet none experienced anything resembling the velocity of the Templar ascent. The order did not grow gradually through demonstrated service. It erupted as though something had been unlocked. Historians have noted this anomaly without resolving it. The standard explanation points to Bernard of Clairvaux's patronage, which is true but circular. Bernard championed the Templars because he believed in their mission. But what convinced him? He was not a man who endorsed lightly. His theological writings are among the most carefully argued of the 12th century. His political interventions were calculated and deliberate. Yet when it came to the Templars, his support was immediate, total, and curiously unexplained. The donations that followed Bernard's endorsement were staggering. Noble houses across France, England, Flanders, Spain, and the Italian states gave freely, land, rents, entire estates, as though responding not merely to a papal recommendation, but to something more urgent, something persuasive enough to open the treasuries of Christendom to a group of men who, on paper, had done nothing but guard a road they never patrolled. Whatever Hugues de Payens carried back from Jerusalem, it was not a story of pilgrims saved. It was something Bernard of Clairvaux recognized instantly and chose to protect absolutely. Bernard of Clairvaux was not a man who left things unexplained. His surviving writings fill volumes, theological treatises, hundreds of sermons, a vast correspondence with popes, kings, and fellow abbots, each argument laid out with the methodical care of a mind that distrusted ambiguity. When Bernard supported a cause, he explained why. When he condemned one, he documented his reasoning. This is what makes his relationship with the Templars so unusual. Around 1136, Bernard authored De Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood, a text that effectively transformed the Templars from a controversial experiment into a theologically sanctioned institution. The document is remarkable for what it accomplishes. It provides a moral framework for the warrior monk, arguing that killing in defense of the faith is not sin, but duty. It elevates the Templar vocation above ordinary knighthood. It grants spiritual legitimacy to an idea that much of the church viewed with open suspicion. But read the text carefully, and a conspicuous absence emerges. Bernard argues passionately that the Templars should be supported. He never explains why he chose to support them. The theological case he builds is abstract. It justifies armed monasticism as a category, not this specific group of men. Nowhere does he describe what the founders told him. Nowhere does he reference private meetings, shared confidences, or any knowledge transmitted from Hugues de Payens to himself. And Bernard was not a man who omitted things carelessly. Like his personal correspondence from the years immediately surrounding the Templar endorsement contains gaps, periods where letters that should exist, based on his otherwise meticulous habits, simply do not. Whether these were lost, destroyed, or never written is unknown. What is known is this: before his encounter with the Templar founders, Bernard had shown no particular interest in military orders. After it, he became their most powerful advocate in Christendom. Something passed between Hugues de Payens and the abbot of Clairvaux that Bernard considered important enough to champion and important enough to never commit to writing. In 1867, a young British Royal Engineers officer named Charles Warren arrived in Jerusalem with a mandate from the Palestine Exploration Fund and a determination to map what lay beneath the city's most contested ground. What he found exceeded every expectation, and what he left unfinished still haunts the archaeology of the Temple Mount today. Warren's team sank shafts and drove tunnels beneath the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, working in conditions that were physically dangerous and politically volatile. They discovered an underground landscape of staggering complexity: passageways, cisterns, vaulted chambers, and corridors cut into the bedrock at different periods and for different purposes, layered over centuries like geological strata made of human intention. Some sections dated to the Herodian period, others were older, their original function uncertain. Among the most significant discoveries were tunnels running directly beneath the area where the Templars had maintained their headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque above. Inside these tunnels, Warren's team recovered artifacts that left little room for doubt: a medieval spur, fragments of a sword, a small cross identified as Templar. The founders had not merely occupied the surface, they had gone down. The spatial relationship was precise. The Templar quarters sat directly above a network of subterranean passages that connected to some of the deepest and oldest chambers beneath the platform, chambers associated with the foundations of the ancient Temple of Solomon itself. The 9 knights had positioned themselves at the one point in Jerusalem that offered private, unmonitored access to the most archaeologically significant underground space in the ancient world. Warren's maps, still referenced by scholars today, show his tunnels extending to a point where further passage was blocked, sealed corridors continuing beyond where his team stopped. Those passages have never been opened by modern archaeologists. Political sensitivities surrounding the Haram al-Sharif have prevented excavation for decades. Whatever lies beyond those seals, the Templars reached it first, and no record survives of what they found there. In 1952, an archaeological team working in Cave 3 near Qumran discovered something unlike anything else in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. It was not parchment. It was copper, 2 rolled sheets of oxidized metal, brittle with age, inscribed with a text that would take years to open and decades to argue about. The copper scroll is an inventory, 64 entries, each describing a location where quantities of gold, silver, and sacred vessels were allegedly concealed. The amounts are enormous: hundreds of talents of precious metal, ritual objects from what appears to be the temple treasury, hidden, the text implies, before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Scholars have debated the scroll's nature since its decipherment. Some regard it as a genuine dispersal record. Others firmly dismiss it as fantasy, an idealized catalog of wealth that never existed. But what has drawn persistent, quiet attention is the scroll's geography. A number of the 64 locations describe sites beneath or immediately adjacent to the Temple Mount, chambers, cisterns, and passages whose descriptions, while often cryptic, correspond with features known to exist in the subterranean landscape that Charles Warren partially mapped 7 centuries after the Templars occupied the surface above. The alignment is not perfect. The Copper Scroll's location descriptions are notoriously difficult to decode, and the underground topography of the Temple Mount has changed over 2 millennia of construction, destruction, and rebuilding. But the overlap is sufficient to raise a question no one has conclusively answered. The Templars dug beneath the Temple Mount for nearly a decade. The Copper Scroll describes treasure hidden beneath the Temple Mount 1,000 years before they arrived. If the founders had access to older traditions, oral accounts, copied texts, maps passed through channels now lost, it would explain both their excavation and the extraordinary wealth that followed their return to Europe. But the link between the scroll and the knights remains circumstantial, suspended in the space between coincidence and confirmation, where so much of this story lives. It is nearly impossible to discuss the Templars and the Temple Mount without first encountering the grand theories. The Ark of the Covenant sealed in a hidden chamber, the Holy Grail recovered from beneath Solomon's foundations, some singular object of transcendent power lifted from the darkness and carried west in secret. These grand narratives are deeply familiar. They are dramatic, and they may be functioning as a distraction. This is not to say they are baseless. The Temple Mount is, by any historical reckoning, a plausible location for concealed sacred objects. The first temple housed the ark according to biblical tradition. The site's successive destructions created precisely the conditions under which precious items would be hidden. The possibility that something of extraordinary religious significance was buried there is not fringe speculation. It is a reasonable inference from the archaeology and the textual record. But the fixation on a single spectacular object, one ark, one grail, one keystone artifact, narrows the question in a way that may obscure a more consequential answer. Because the Templars' behavior after their return from Jerusalem does not suggest men who had found a relic. It suggests men who had found a system. Their architectural innovations did not reflect possession of an object. They reflected possession of knowledge, geometric principles, proportional relationships, structural concepts that appeared in their buildings without identifiable European precedent. Their financial instruments did not emerge from captured treasure. They emerged from sophisticated mathematical and administrative frameworks. Their navigational reach did not expand because they held something sacred. It expanded because they understood something structural about how the ancient world had organized space, movement, and exchange. The Grail and Ark narratives point backward, always backward, toward Jerusalem as the center and the answer, but the Templars' subsequent trajectory points outward toward connections, influences, and design traditions that Jerusalem alone cannot explain. The question may not be what object they found, and it may be what knowledge they recognized. When the Templars began building across Europe, something appeared in their architecture that no one could trace. The Temple Church in London, consecrated in 1185, is built on a circular plan, unusual for a medieval Christian church, where the cruciform layout was not merely traditional, but theologically mandated. The Church of the Vera Cruz in Segovia follows a 12-sided polygon enclosing an inner chamber. The rotunda at the Convent of Christ in Tamar employs an octagonal geometry of striking mathematical precision. Across commanderies in southern France, proportional systems appear in foundations and floor plans that do not correspond to any known Romanesque building tradition. Architectural historians have acknowledged these anomalies for decades, but the standard explanation attributes them to imitation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, a reasonable hypothesis until you examine the geometry closely. The Holy Sepulchre's rotunda is circular, not octagonal. Its proportions derive from late Roman architectural practice. The spatial relationships in Templar buildings are fundamentally different, more rigorous, more mathematically self-conscious, organized around principles suggesting familiarity with harmonic ratios absent from medieval European construction. The octagon, in particular, recurs with a frequency that demands explanation. It is not a natural form in Christian sacred architecture. It carries no obvious Christological symbolism, but it is a form of profound significance in Islamic geometric art, and before that, in the sacred architecture of ancient Egypt, where octagonal and eightfold symmetries appear in temple plans, column arrangements, and spatial proportions documented at sites along the Nile. This resemblance has been noted by individual researchers working independently across different decades. It has never been the subject of a comprehensive, systematic study. The connection remains precisely where it has sat for over a century, observed, occasionally referenced, and never pursued to its conclusion. Whatever the Templars learned beneath the Temple Mount, it followed them home, and it expressed itself in stone, in forms that pointed not toward Jerusalem, but somewhere older and further south. In the summer of 1218, a crusader fleet arrived at the mouth of the Nile and laid siege to the Egyptian port city of Damietta. The Fifth Crusade had begun, and from its earliest days, and to do nothing about it made strategic sense. The campaign was ostensibly part of the broader ongoing effort to recover Jerusalem, which had been lost to Saladin's forces decades earlier. But the Crusaders did not march toward Jerusalem. They invaded Egypt, a decision that required crossing the Mediterranean, establishing a beachhead in hostile territory, and sustaining a military operation hundreds of miles from the Holy Land they claimed to be liberating. The Templars were central to this effort. Senior commanders of the order occupied key positions in the campaign's leadership, and Templar forces were deployed not as auxiliaries, but as the operational core of the invasion. What followed was strategically inexplicable. After capturing Damietta in 1219, the Crusaders received an extraordinary offer from Sultan al-Kamil, the peaceful return of Jerusalem, including the True Cross, in exchange for a full withdrawal from Egypt. By any rational calculation, this was the fulfillment of the crusading mission. Jerusalem handed back without further bloodshed. The offer was rejected. The Crusaders pushed deeper into the delta, moving south toward Cairo along routes that required detailed knowledge of the Nile's seasonal flooding patterns, its navigable channels, and its inland geography. The campaign ultimately ended in disaster. The army was trapped by rising waters and forced to surrender. But the Templars' conduct during the advance has drawn scrutiny from historians who note that their route selections and deployment patterns suggest familiarity with Egyptian terrain that the broader Crusader force did not share. The question is not why the Fifth Crusade failed. Military campaigns fail for many reasons. The question is why an army devoted to recovering Jerusalem refused Jerusalem when it was freely offered and chose instead to remain in Egypt, moving inland as though Egypt itself were the objective. 30 years after Damietta, another French king brought another army to Egypt, and the result was another catastrophe. though this one would reveal something the first had only hinted at. In 1249, King Louis IX of France launched the Seventh Crusade with a second invasion of Egypt, again targeting Damietta as the entry point. The campaign initially succeeded. The city fell quickly, but the subsequent march toward Cairo ended in the Battle of Fariskour in 1250, where the Crusader army was routed and Louis himself was captured by the Mamluk forces. It was the most humiliating moment of the entire crusading era. A Christian king held prisoner in the land of his enemies, awaiting a ransom he could not pay from his own treasury. The ransom was arranged through Templar financial channels. This alone is significant. It confirms that the order's banking infrastructure was sophisticated enough to mobilize enormous sums across international boundaries under wartime conditions, but the details of the negotiation are where the story becomes less transparent. Senior Templar officials were dispatched to Cairo to conduct the ransom talks, and their presence in Egypt extended for months, far longer than the diplomatic process required. Some contemporary accounts, notably those preserved in Joinville's chronicle of Louis's crusade, reference Templar representatives moving through the Cairo region during this period in ways that were not obviously connected to the ransom negotiations. The specific locations they visited are not recorded, and the purposes of their extended stays are not explained. And when historians have looked for the financial records that should document these months of activity, the ledgers, the correspondence, the accounting of expenditures, they have found gaps. The order's financial records from this precise period are unusually incomplete. The standard explanation is wartime disruption. Documents are lost in conflict, but the gap is remarkably clean, as though the records were not lost but removed, leaving precisely the void necessary to obscure where the Templars' representatives went and what they encountered during their months in Egypt. Wars make noise. Trade, when it is conducted carefully, does not. And beneath the military confrontations that dominate the Crusader narrative, the Templars appear to have maintained a commercial relationship with Egypt that was quieter, older, and far more systematic than any chronicle acknowledged. The evidence is not dramatic, it is clerical. The kind of information that survives in shipping manifests, port ledgers, and the inventories of European commanderies where goods were cataloged upon arrival. Recent scholarship examining these records has identified a persistent pattern. Egyptian origin materials appearing in Templar holdings with a regularity that cannot be explained by occasional wartime plunder or incidental trade. Papyrus, specific mineral pigments used in manuscript illumination and valued for their rarity. Natron, a naturally occurring compound with both industrial and ritual applications, sourced almost exclusively from the mineral deposits of Egyptian lake beds. These materials moved through intermediary ports, Acre, Tyre, and smaller harbors along the Levantine coast, where Templar-operated ships connected established Mediterranean trade routes to suppliers operating within the Nile Delta. The logistics required agents, sustained relationships with Egyptian merchants, and navigational knowledge of both coastal and inland river systems. This was not improvised or merely occasional commerce. It was deliberate infrastructure, deliberate, organized, and maintained across decades, and it predated the major crusading campaigns. Port records suggest that Templar-connected trade with Egyptian intermediaries was already operational at least a decade before the Fifth Crusade's invasion of Damietta, meaning the order was simultaneously waging holy war against Egypt's Muslim rulers and conducting sustained, systematic business with Egypt's merchant networks throughout the same period. The contradiction is stark. A religious military order sworn to defend Christendom against Islam, maintaining ongoing commercial relationships with the very civilization it was pledged to oppose. This is either hypocrisy of an extraordinary kind, or it is evidence that the order's actual mission operated on a different plane entirely, one where the crusading framework was the cover, not the purpose. The pyramids you see today are not the pyramids a medieval traveler would have seen. This distinction matters more than most histories acknowledge. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Great Pyramid at Giza still retained a significant portion of its original white limestone casing, the smooth, polished outer shell that had given the structure its intended geometric precision for millennia. Okay, the surrounding plateau was not the barren, tourist-scoured expanse familiar from modern photographs. Secondary structures, causeways, and subsidiary buildings remained partially intact. The Sphinx, though already ancient, was less eroded and differently buried. A visitor to Giza during the Crusader era would have encountered a dramatically more complete and more informative site than what survives in the 21st century. Arab scholars of the period carefully documented what they saw with remarkable precision. Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi, writing around 1200, described inscriptions covering the casing stones, text that he found too extensive to fully copy and that no longer exists, having been permanently lost when the casing was stripped for building material in subsequent centuries. Other observers noted interior chambers, passages, and architectural features that have since collapsed or been sealed. The site was actively studied by medieval Arab intellectuals who recognized its deep significance and recorded details now permanently lost to history. Among these accounts, scattered across multiple sources and never systematically compiled, are references to European visitors. Unnamed Franks, the generic Arab term for Western Europeans, who arrived at the plateau with local guides and remained for days, not hours. They are described as examining specific features, measuring structures, and showing an interest that went beyond casual curiosity. Those accounts have never been cross-referenced with Templar movement records from the same decades. The absence of a confirmed connection is not the same as the absence of a connection, and the Giza Plateau during the Crusader era was not a ruin. It was still, in many respects, a functioning archive, one written in stone, still legible to anyone who arrived knowing what questions to ask. Alexandria had been the intellectual capital of the ancient world. By the Crusader era, it was something more complex, a sprawling port city layered with the residue of every civilization that had passed through it, still functioning as a vital conduit between Mediterranean Europe and the deeper knowledge traditions of the Arabic-speaking East. The Templars had connections to this organized city. The evidence is not abundant, but it is consistent. Port records and commercial documents from the 12th and 13th centuries indicate that the order maintained agents or factors in Alexandria, individuals specifically tasked with managing trade relationships, arranging regular shipments, and serving as intermediaries between the Latin Christian world and the broader Egyptian commercial network. These were not military positions, and they were logistical and quite possibly intellectual ones. Alexandria's significance extended far beyond commerce. The city had been home to the Great Library, long destroyed by the Crusader period, but whose intellectual legacy survived in fragments scattered across Coptic monasteries, private collections, and the curricula of Islamic scholarly institutions. Mathematical treatises, astronomical tables, philosophical texts, and practical navigational knowledge circulated through Alexandrian networks with surprising fluidity, passing between Arabic, Greek, Coptic, and Latin traditions in ways that the rigid boundaries of the conventional Crusader narrative tend to obscure. The Templars' financial innovations have long puzzled economic historians. Letters of credit, precursors to double entry accounting, interest bearing instruments. These appeared in European Templar operations with no clear developmental genealogy. They did not evolve gradually from existing European practices. They arrived fully formed as though carefully adapted from a more mature and sophisticated system. Arabic and Egyptian financial models, well documented in Alexandrian commercial practice, offer the most plausible source, but the archival trail dissolves precisely where it would become most revealing. Alexandria's own records were ravaged by centuries of conflict, and whatever documentation might have detailed exactly what materials, texts, or knowledge systems passed through Templar hands has not survived. The conduit existed. What flowed through it remains obscured. Actually, there is a body of knowledge that shadows the Templar story without ever being directly named within it, a tradition so old that by the medieval period, its very origins had already become the substance of mythology. The Hermetic texts are attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, a figure who was not a historical person but a synthesis. He merged the Greek Hermes with the Egyptian Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of writing, knowledge, measurement, and cosmic order. The texts bearing his name encompass philosophy, cosmology, alchemy, and a theory of sacred knowledge that predates Christianity by centuries. They represent one of the deepest intellectual currents of the ancient world. In mainstream European history, the Hermetic tradition arrived suddenly in 1463 when Marsilio Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin for Cosimo de' Medici in Florence. But this narrative of sudden appearance conceals a longer, quieter, and more complex history of transmission. Fragments of Hermetic thought, specific cosmological ideas, alchemical principles, geometric frameworks, appear in European texts well before Ficino's translation. They surface in the writings of monastic scholars, in the symbolic programs of the great cathedral builders, and in circles associated directly or through circumstantial evidence with the Knights Templar and their extended intellectual networks. The geography of Hermetic survival maps precisely onto Templar operational territory. These texts were preserved in Coptic monasteries in Upper Egypt, in Arabic translations circulating through the scholarly communities of Cairo and Alexandria, and in repositories connected to the Byzantine intellectual tradition. The Templars had documented or suspected presence in each of these environments during the critical decades of the 12th and 13th centuries. If the order served as even one of the channels through which Hermetic knowledge re-entered medieval Europe, then the conventional understanding of the Templars requires fundamental revision. They would not be a military order that happened to manage money. They would be a knowledge transmission network that used military and financial operations as its institutional cover. This is where the evidence thins and the resonance deepens, a combination that makes historians uncomfortable and that the story itself seems to demand. Abydos lies in Upper Egypt, south of the major Crusader-era contact zones, in territory that no Frankish army ever occupied and no Western institution had any documented reason to visit. It was one of the most sacred sites in ancient Egyptian religion, the cult center of Osiris, god of death and resurrection, and a pilgrimage destination for millennia before Christianity existed. For most purposes, it sits outside the boundaries of the Templar narrative entirely, except for one structure. Behind the Temple of Seti, the first at Abydos, stands the Osirion, a subterranean building of extraordinary and deeply anomalous character. Unlike the surrounding temples, which are lavishly decorated with elaborate reliefs And built from relatively modest stone blocks, the osirayon is constructed from massive, unadorned megalithic stones fitted together with a precision that belongs to a different architectural tradition entirely. Its date of construction remains actively debated. Some scholars attribute it to Seti I himself. Others argue its construction techniques strongly suggest a significantly earlier origin. The building incorporates subterranean water channels and is oriented around an artificial island, a mound rising from water, evoking the Egyptian creation myth with architectural literalism. Certain features of the Osirian, its emphasis on massive, undecorated stone, its subterranean water systems, its relationship between built structure and primordial mound, have been compared cautiously by some architectural historians and more aggressively by fringe researchers to elements that appear in Templar constructions across Europe. The parallels are suggestive rather than conclusive. There is no documentary evidence that any Templar ever visited Abydos, but the absence of documentary evidence is a recurring and familiar condition of this entire investigation. No documents place the Templars at most Egyptian sites where circumstantial indicators of their influence later appear. The silence is remarkably consistent, and at a certain point, consistent silence stops being merely an absence and begins to resemble a pattern. The octagon keeps appearing, and no one has adequately explained why. Across medieval Europe, the Templars built churches and commanderies that defied the architectural conventions of their time. The Temple Church in London, a circular nave consecrated in 1185, the Church of the True Cross in Segovia, a 12-sided polygon, Templar chapels at Laon, Metz, and across southern France, employing octagonal geometries with mathematical precision that their Romanesque and early Gothic neighbors simply did not possess. The standard explanation attributes these designs to imitation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the rotunda built over Christ's tomb. It is a reasonable hypothesis, and it satisfies most casual inquiries, but it does not survive close examination. The Holy Sepulchre is circular, not octagonal. Its proportional relationships derive from late Roman building practice, a different mathematical tradition entirely. The Templar octagon is not a circle approximated. It is a distinct geometric form deployed with deliberate precision. The octagon has specific mathematical properties that clearly distinguish it from other regular polygons. It mediates between the square and the circle, a geometric reconciliation that carries deep symbolic meaning in traditions that understood geometry as a form of sacred language. In Islamic geometric art, the octagon is a foundational form, generating the complex tessellations that adorn mosques across the medieval world. And before Islam, in the sacred architecture of ancient Egypt, eightfold symmetries appear in temple layouts, column arrangements, and the proportional frameworks that govern the design of sacred spaces along the Nile. The Templar preference for this form appeared in Europe suddenly. It did not evolve from Romanesque precedent. It did not develop gradually through regional experimentation. It arrived, introduced into the European architectural vocabulary by an organization that had spent decades in the Near East and that chose, conspicuously, never to identify where its design principles originated. The octagon was not borrowed from Jerusalem. It came from somewhere else the Templars were not prepared to name. Chartres Cathedral is one of the supreme achievements of medieval architecture, a structure whose engineering precision, spatial harmony, and luminous interior have inspired wonder for 8 centuries. It is also a building with a shadow history. that its official narrative has never fully absorbed. The Templars had documented financial connections to the construction of Chartres. The order contributed significant funds to the building campaign, and there exists a persistent tradition, not definitively proven but stubbornly resistant to dismissal, that Templar-associated Masons were directly involved in the cathedral's design and construction. The precise nature of this involvement, if it occurred, has never been clearly specified, but the building itself contains features that demand explanation beyond conventional accounts. The labyrinth set into the floor of Chartres Cathedral is the most famous surviving example of its kind. It is not a maze. It has a single path, winding inward through 11 concentric circuits to a central rosette. Its geometry is precise to a degree that far exceeds mere decorative intent. The labyrinth's diameter relates to the nave's dimensions through proportional ratios that suggest deliberate and sophisticated mathematical planning. Its design can be generated through geometric operations that have no precedent in the Romanesque tradition from which Chartres nominally descends. What does have precedent is older and geographically distant. The proportional systems documented at the Temple of Luxor, analyzed in detail by scholars studying Egyptian sacred architecture, employ geometric relationships that produce strikingly similar spatial harmonics. The method of generating complex curved paths through the recursive subdivision of circles and squares is not a European medieval technique. It is an ancient one. No surviving medieval European document explains how the Chartres Masons learned these specific principles. The cathedral's geometry points toward a deeper source tradition that was transmitted through channels the official record does not describe. The Templars were present at Chartres. They were present in Egypt. What passed between those two presences remains undocumented and unresolved. There is a measurement that keeps appearing where it should not exist, a unit of length that belongs to the banks of the Nile, surfacing in the stone foundations of medieval European buildings separated from Egypt by 1,000 miles and 2,000 years. The ancient Egyptian royal cubit measures approximately 52.4 centimeters. It was the fundamental unit of pharaonic architecture, the measure from which proportions of temples, pyramids, and sacred enclosures were derived. It was not merely a length, it was a generative tool. The royal cubit carried within it subdivisions and proportional relationships that allowed architects to scale designs while preserving harmonic ratios. Just when Egypt's civilization receded, the cubit should have disappeared with it. It did not. Beginning in the mid-20th century, researchers working independently began identifying a recurring anomaly in certain medieval European structures. Dimensional analyses of Templar commanderies in southern France revealed measurements conforming to neither the standard medieval foot, the Roman pies, nor any other European unit in common use. They did, however, align with the Egyptian royal cubit, not approximately, but with a consistency that repeated examination confirmed. The pattern extended beyond Templar buildings. The rotunda at Tamar, built by the order's Portuguese successors, yielded proportional relationships based on cubit-derived ratios. The metrological surveys of early Gothic cathedrals constructed during peak Templar influence identified similar alignments. The cubit, or something functionally identical, appeared to be embedded in the design principles of buildings whose architects had no officially recognized connection to ancient Egypt. The methodological objections are real. Measurement analysis is vulnerable to confirmation bias. If you look for a specific unit, you may find it in coincidental alignments. But the pattern has recurred across several independent studies by researchers who were not coordinating their respective work. If the cubit was present in these buildings, someone transmitted it. not as an isolated number, but as a living system of proportional design. And whoever received it understood not just the measurement, but the entire architecture it was meant to generate. Before dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, agents of King Philip IV of France executed simultaneous raids on Templar properties across the kingdom. The arrests were coordinated with a precision that suggests months of planning. Sealed orders opened on the same morning, thousands of knights seized before word could spread. It was one of the most effective security operations of the medieval period, but the arrests were only the visible action. What happened to the document may have mattered more. Philip's agents descended on the Paris Temple, the order's European headquarters and the administrative seat of its vast, continent-spanning organizational apparatus. They confiscated everything: financial ledgers, correspondence with commanderies across Europe and the Near East, internal governance records, chapter general proceedings, and materials whose specific nature was never publicly described in any surviving royal inventory. The archive of one of the most powerful and secretive institutions in Christendom was seized in its entirety within a single morning. What followed was not wholesale destruction. It was triage. Some records were transferred to the French Royal Archives, where fragments survive to this day. Some were passed to the Knights Hospitaller, who inherited Templar properties and needed administrative documentation to manage them. But a significant portion, its size never officially quantified, was burned, deliberately, selectively, and without any public accounting of what was destroyed. The selectivity is the critical detail. Eugene Philip's agents did not simply pile documents into a fire, they sorted them first. Financial records useful to the crown were preserved, property deeds transferable to new owners were kept, but other materials, their contents undescribed, their categories unnamed, were consigned to flames by people who had read them and decided they could not survive. Someone within Philip's operation understood what the Templar archive contained. Someone made decisions about what was dangerous and what was merely valuable. The burning was not chaos. It was careful curation, and the criteria that governed it have never been disclosed. For nearly 700 years, a document lay misfiled in the Vatican archives that would have changed the Templar story, had anyone known to look for it. In 2001, a Vatican medievalist named Barbara Frailo discovered the Chinon parchment while conducting research in the Apostolic Archive. The document, dated August 1308, recorded a secret papal inquiry into the Templar leadership, a confidential investigation conducted by 3 cardinals, acting on Pope Clement V's direct authority. Its conclusion was extraordinary. The Pope had privately absolved the Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay and other senior leaders of all heresy charges brought against them by Philip IV's inquisitors. The implications were immediate. The public trial of the Templars, the confessions extracted under torture, the formal charges of idol worship, blasphemy, and obscene rituals had proceeded for months after this secret absolution was granted. Clement V had known, or at minimum believed, that the Templar leadership was not guilty of heresy, and he had continued to allow the trial to unfold as though this knowledge did not exist. The Chinon parchment reveals a pope caught between private conviction and public cowardice, a man who privately exonerated the accused but publicly permitted their destruction under political pressure. He ultimately could not resist. It answers the question of papal belief definitively. Clement did not think the Templars were heretics, but the document's precise language introduces a deeper and more troubling puzzle. The absolution is carefully, almost surgically, constructed to address the formal charges without ever specifying what the Templars actually believed or practiced in their inner ceremonies. It exonerates without explaining. It forgives without describing what required forgiveness. This is not accidental legal drafting. This is deliberate circumnavigation, language designed to close one door while ensuring another remains permanently sealed. Whatever the Templars possessed, whatever they knew or practiced, whatever private ceremonies their inner circle maintained, the Chinon parchment was written to avoid naming it. Even in an act of mercy, the specifics were treated as too sensitive to record. On the night of October 12th, 1307, the evening before Philip IV's agents executed their coordinated raids across France, the Templar fleet vanished from the port of La Rochelle. By morning, when the arrest began, the harbor was empty. This is not legend. It is a logistical fact that the historical record cannot explain. La Rochelle was one of the most significant naval bases in medieval France, and the Templar fleet stationed there was substantial. The order operated one of the largest maritime forces in both the Mediterranean and the Atlantic, warships, transport vessels, and commercial carriers that had sustained Crusader logistics for generations. These ships required crews, provisions, and coordinated navigation. They did not simply drift away, yet no record documents where they went. Philip's agents, who had planned the arrests with extraordinary secrecy, found no ships to seize. No subsequent investigation located the fleet. No port in France, England, or the Mediterranean reported their arrival. The vessels and their cargo disappeared completely from the documentary record. The disappearance implies advance warning. Someone with knowledge of Philip's plans, someone inside the French court or papal administration, alerted the order in time for a coordinated naval evacuation. This alone is significant, suggesting the Templars maintained intelligence networks capable of penetrating the highest levels of European power, even in their final days. But the deeper question concerns what the fleet carried. Ships can transport gold, and the Templars possessed enormous wealth. Yet gold is heavy, traceable, and ultimately replaceable. If the order had hours to evacuate its most irreplaceable assets, materials that could not be reconstructed from memory or repurchased, the priority would have been documents, relics, and accumulated knowledge. The fleet sailed into total historical silence. Whatever it carried has never been recovered, cataloged, or confirmed. Theories place the ships in Scotland, Portugal, or beyond. The evidence places them nowhere, which is precisely the kind of absence that tends to mean something. The Templars were destroyed in France. They were dissolved across most of Europe. But in Portugal, they simply changed their name and continued. This is not conspiracy. It is documented administrative history. When Pope Clement V issued the bull dissolving the Templar order in 1312, King Denis I of Portugal refused to comply in substance. He formally dissolved the Portuguese Templars as required by papal decree, then immediately established a new institution, the Order of Christ, and transferred to it every Templar property, every asset, and virtually every member within his kingdom. The personnel were the same, the infrastructure was the same, the knowledge was the same, and only the name changed. The Order of Christ did not retreat into obscurity. It became one of the most consequential institutions of the early modern period. Its Grand Masters included Henry the Navigator, the prince whose systematic sponsorship of maritime exploration launched Portugal's Age of Discovery. Templar ships, now sailing under the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, pushed down the West African coast, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually reached India and Brazil. What powered this expansion was not merely royal ambition, it was navigational knowledge, maps, charts, and an understanding of Atlantic wind patterns, and ocean currents that exceeded anything other European institutions possessed in the early 15th century. Portuguese navigators knew things they should not have known. They sailed with a confidence that presupposed familiarity with coastlines no European had officially visited, and with maritime routes no documented expedition had charted. The Order of Christ is the institutional bridge between the medieval Templars and the broader European transformation of the globe. It preserved institutional continuity where everywhere else there was rupture and dissolution, and the geographical knowledge it deployed, knowledge whose ultimate origin no historian has satisfactorily traced, suggests that what the Templars carried west was not merely wealth or tradition, but something that quietly redrew due to the boundaries of the known world. The charges read like a litany of horror, but they begin in silence. In October 1307, under orders from King Philip IV of France, Templars were arrested at dawn and confronted with accusations so extreme they seemed almost theatrical. Denial of Christ, spitting upon the cross, obscene kisses during initiation, worship of a mysterious head called Baphomet. To modernize, the list appears either grotesquely fabricated or evidence of genuine depravity. Yet the structure of the accusations follows a pattern that inquisitors had used before. Officially, the Templars were said to have renounced Christ during their initiation rites, to have trampled or spat upon the crucifix as proof of loyalty to the order over the church. They were accused of secret ceremonies conducted in darkness, of illicit embraces, of idol worship centered on a severed head. These elements echo earlier prosecutions against the Cathars and Waldensians, denial of orthodoxy, inversion of sacred symbols, hidden gatherings. The Inquisition had a template for heresy, and the Templars were made to fit it, but not perfectly. The Baphomet charge refuses to settle into the expected script. Unlike the generic accusations of blasphemy or moral corruption, Baphomet appears nowhere else in inquisitorial records. Some scholars argue the word is a corruption of Mahomet, a medieval term for Muhammad, suggesting an implied Islamic contamination. Yet the descriptions do not align with Islamic practice. Witnesses under interrogation spoke of a bearded head, sometimes metallic, sometimes wooden, occasionally with two faces. Some claimed it radiated light. Others said it whispered secrets. If this was mere slander, it was oddly specific. If it was invention, it drew on imagery foreign to standard Christian polemic. And if it was distorted testimony, then distortion implies an original form. The Inquisition called it idolatry. The transcripts call it a head. No one ever explained what that head was supposed to represent. Under torture, men contradict themselves. They forget, they invent, they echo what they think their interrogators want to hear. And yet, when the testimonies concerning Baphomet are laid side by side, something stranger than chaos emerges. The descriptions differ, but they orbit a common center. One Templar described a bearded male head with hollow eyes. Another spoke of a head with two faces, front and back like Janus. Others claimed it was neither entirely human nor wholly animal. A few insisted it was not worshipped as a god, but revered as something else, a source of power or knowledge. The inconsistencies have often been treated as proof of fabrication, but inconsistency does not always mean invention. It can also signal partial access. Not every member of the order would have seen the same object in the same context. If there was a ritual head, it may have appeared differently depending on rank or region. Fragmented descriptions may reflect fragmented encounters. And then there is Thoth. In Egyptian tradition, Thoth, later syncretized with Hermes Trismegistus, was the god of writing, measurement, sacred calculation. Often depicted with the head of an ibis, he embodied knowledge itself. In certain ritual contexts, heads carried symbolic weight, repositories of wisdom, containers of divine speech. Through Hellenistic transmission, Thoth became Hermes, patron of hidden sciences. The Hermetic corpus circulated in medieval intellectual circles, often attributed to ancient Egyptian sages. A bearded head, a two-faced figure, a symbol of knowledge concealed within ritual. These are not proofs, but they are echoes. If Baphomet was a garbled memory of a Hermetic image, the Templars were not rejecting Christianity. They were layering it, incorporating something older beneath it, and that would have been more dangerous than open apostasy. The transcripts from Paris, Poitiers, Chinon, and beyond are chaotic documents shaped by fear and force. No confession extracted under torture can be accepted at face value. And yet, when the noise is reduced, when the repetition is separated from the embellishment, patterns remain. Across distant regions, Templars admitted to a secret shown only to higher-ranking members. They described initiation rites in which outward forms were denied, not permanently, but symbolically. A novice might be instructed to renounce Christ verbally, only to be told later that the renunciation was a test, proof that he understood the difference between appearance and essence. Several confessed that what the order valued most was not wealth or land, but knowledge. Many denied worshiping a demon. Few denied the existence of an inner teaching. The consistency is subtle. Not every Templar spoke of progressive revelation, but enough did to suggest structure. Not every confession mentioned symbolic death and rebirth, but enough referred to graded access, to hidden meanings reserved for the initiated. These elements do not align cleanly with devil worship. They resemble initiation. Ancient mystery traditions, including those reconstructed from Egyptian sources, followed similar patterns. Outer ritual masking inner doctrine, symbolic humiliation preceding illumination, the privileging of gnosis over formal creed. The Templars never named Egypt in their testimonies. They never invoked Thoth or Hermes, but they spoke again and again of a knowledge not available to all. If torture forced invention, why did invention cluster around the same architecture of secrecy? The inquisitors heard blasphemy. The transcripts whisper structure, and structure implies origin, a lineage of teaching that the accused would not, or could not, identify by name. The cleanest explanation is often the most appealing. According to the skeptical position, the Knights Templar were exactly what their charter described, a military religious order formed to protect pilgrims and stabilize crusader territories. Over time, they evolved into a sophisticated financial institution, managing estates, issuing letters of credit, and operating across Europe and the Levant. Their sudden destruction in 1307 was political, engineered by Philip IV to erase debts and consolidate power. The heresy charges were convenient fiction. Egypt, in this view, is a projection layered onto medieval history by later Romanticism. This argument has weight. The financial records are real. The papal bulls are explicit. The mechanics of Philip's ambition are well documented. Gothic architecture can be explained through incremental development and contact with Islamic craftsmen. Navigational advances in Portugal can be traced to Iberian maritime traditions. Baphomet, skeptics argue, was either a corruption of Mahomet or a hallucination induced by torture. Taken individually, each anomaly can be explained, but the explanation requires containment. The founding period excavations beneath the Temple Mount must be treated as symbolic or strategic, not investigative. The specificity of the Baphomet imagery must be dismissed as coincidence. Architectural correspondences with Egyptian proportional systems must be reduced to convergent evolution. The navigational sophistication of the Order of Christ must be detached from its Templar inheritance. Each thread is isolated, trimmed, neutralized. The skeptical model is strongest when confronting a single claim. It weakens when confronting convergence. Now, because the anomalies are not confined to one domain, they appear in ritual testimony, in architectural form, in financial abstraction, in maritime expansion. To sustain the minimalist interpretation, each of these must be coincidental, separate accidents sharing no underlying cause. That is possible. But coincidence accumulates weight. And at a certain point, the burden shifts, not to prove an Egyptian connection, but to explain why so many irregularities align without one. Even if the Templars encountered Egyptian knowledge, it would not have arrived as a pristine inheritance from pharaonic priests. Civilizations do not transmit themselves intact across millennia. They fragment, translate, reinterpret. By the 12th century, whatever survived of ancient Egypt lived inside layers of mediation, as Baghdad's House of Wisdom had preserved and expanded upon Greek and Hellenistic texts, many of which traced intellectual ancestry to Alexandria. In Fatimid Cairo, philosophical circles debated cosmology, using language that blended Islamic theology with older Hermetic concepts. Coptic monasteries in Upper Egypt guarded manuscripts whose origins were sometimes obscure even to their keepers. In Toledo, translators rendered Arabic scientific and philosophical works into Latin, feeding Europe's intellectual revival. By the time Crusaders entered the Eastern Mediterranean, Egyptian knowledge was no longer Egyptian in appearance. It was Islamic, Byzantine, hybrid. If the Templars acquired something, it likely came through these channels, through scholars, merchants, mystics. And what they encountered would have been layered. Greek geometry filtered through Arabic commentary, Hermetic philosophy embedded within Islamic metaphysics, mathematical systems preserved in artistic practice. This complicates the narrative. It removes the drama of a hidden chamber beneath Giza containing untouched secrets. It replaces it with palimpsest, text written over text, meaning buried beneath interpretation. And it raises an unsettling possibility. If the Templars received knowledge through intermediaries, they may not have recognized its ultimate origin. They may have absorbed Egyptian-derived concepts without knowing they were Egyptian, which means the order could have become a carrier of traditions whose roots extended further back than even they understood, transmitting something ancient without naming it. Chronology is supposed to stabilize history. Dates anchor causation. Yet when the Templar Egypt question is plotted against the timeline, fractures appear. Certain architectural features attributed to Templar transmission, proportional systems, solar alignments, geometric floor plans, appear in European structures whose construction predates the order's plausible exposure to Egyptian intermediaries. Some financial mechanisms associated with Templar innovation show precursors in Italian merchant networks before sustained Levantine contact. Hermetic ideas circulating in Templar-adjacent intellectual circles appear in manuscript traditions that suggest earlier European familiarity than the Crusader timeline permits. These inconsistencies destabilize both extremes. If the Egyptian connection is fiction, why do the anomalies precede the order? And if the Templars were sole transmitters, how did similar ideas surface before their influence could account for them? The fractures suggest diffusion rather than origin, a network rather than a single channel. Perhaps Egyptian-derived knowledge was already filtering into Europe through multiple routes, Andalusian scholarship, monastic exchanges, mercantile contact. The Templars may not have been the first to encounter it. They may have been the first to institutionalize it, an amplifier, not a source. This reframes their significance. Instead of discovering something entirely unknown, they may have recognized the coherence of fragments already circulating, geometry here, finance there, mystical symbolism elsewhere, and woven them into a structured order. If so, the timeline does not break. And it widens, and the order's true role becomes more deliberate, not inventors of transmission, but accelerators of it. There is another pathway, quieter and less discussed. During the Crusader period, Sufi orders flourished in Egypt and the Levant. These mystical brotherhoods emphasized inner knowledge over outward conformity, symbolic interpretation over literalism, geometry as reflection of divine order. Their lodges operated in cities where Templars maintained commanderies. Contact was not only possible, it was likely. Scholars have noted parallels. The initiatory structure described in Templar confessions, graded revelation, symbolic testing, distinction between outer form and inner truth, mirrors Sufi pedagogical models. The language of hidden wisdom, of a truth concealed beneath ritual, appears in both traditions. Even architectural symbolism overlaps, geometric abstraction as spiritual language. Sufism itself did not arise in isolation. Many historians acknowledge that early Islamic mysticism absorbed elements from pre-Islamic Egyptian and Hellenistic traditions. Alexandria's intellectual heritage did not vanish with Rome. It transformed. If Templars interacted with Sufi mystics, what they encountered would have been Egyptian concepts wrapped in Islamic theology. Not pagan idols, but metaphysical frameworks. Not relics, but contemplative systems. This possibility shifts the focus away from artifacts and toward ideas. The Egyptian thread may have entered the order not through excavation or theft, but through conversation, through shared fascination with geometry, cosmology, inner transformation. And if that is true, then the knowledge the Templars carried was not architectural or financial at its core. It was theological, which means the church may have feared not a rival army, but a rival understanding of the sacred. Behind the bronze doors of the Vatican Apostolic Archive lies the largest surviving collection of Templar documentation in the world. For centuries, it was known somewhat ominously as the secret archives, secret not in the sense of forbidden conspiracy, but in the older Latin meaning, private. Papal correspondence, trial records, depositions, financial inventories, the paper trail of an institution dismantled in public, yet preserved in ink. Officially, the archive has been studied. Selected documents have been published. Historians have sifted through volumes of proceedings from Paris, Chinon, and beyond. Yet the Church maintains that the Templar case is thoroughly documented, and yet the archive has surprised us before. In 2001, a parchment misfiled for centuries was rediscovered, the Chinon parchment. It recorded that Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the Templar leadership of heresy in 1308. For nearly 700 years, this document had sat unnoticed, not suppressed, not burned, simply cataloged incorrectly. Its existence reshaped the narrative overnight. If a document of that magnitude could remain effectively invisible for centuries, what else lies in the same labyrinth of parchment and dust? The Vatican holds thousands of folios related to the order, many uncatalogued in comprehensive modern inventories. Access is granted selectively, often limited by research scope or language barriers. Scholars request boxes. Archivists retrieve what is listed, but what of what is not listed? The official position is confidence. The material has been examined, the case is closed. Yet the rediscovery of the Chinon parchment contradicts that assurance. It proves that oversight, misfiling, or bureaucratic inertia can obscure history without malice. And if absolution could be misplaced, what might have been miscategorized under another heading entirely? The Templars were born in ink. In 1129, their order received formal recognition from Pope Honorius II. A decade later, the bull Omni Datum Optimum granted them privileges unprecedented in medieval Christendom. Exemption from local bishops, the right to collect their own tithes, the authority to appoint their own priests. They answered directly to the Pope. No intermediary, no diocesan oversight. This autonomy was extraordinary. It effectively created a sovereign entity within the Church, shielded from ordinary scrutiny. The language of Omni Datum Optimum is meticulous when defining rights and protections. It specifies legal jurisdiction, property exemptions, procedural authority. What it does not specify is equally striking. It says almost nothing about internal doctrine, ritual practice, or intellectual orientation. The order's spiritual life is assumed, not described. This pattern persists. Subsequent bulls reaffirm privileges, clarify disputes, defend Templar property. They treat the order as administrative fact. Nowhere do they outline its inner theology. Then, in 1312, Vox in excelso dissolved the order. Yet, even here, precision is selective, and the bull suppresses the Templars by apostolic provision, not by judicial condemnation. It avoids declaring them heretical. It ends the institution without adjudicating the truth of the charges. The papacy could define property boundaries in exhaustive detail. It could specify tithe exemptions line by line, but it never described what the Templars believed. Perhaps it did not need to, or perhaps the silence was intentional, a protective ambiguity around a knowledge-holding body whose contents were better left undefined. Clement V did not move against the Templars immediately. When Philip IV ordered their arrest in 1307, the Pope protested the unilateral action. He sought delay. He insisted on ecclesiastical jurisdiction. The record suggests hesitation, even reluctance. The Chinon parchment reveals something further. In 1308, the Clement absolved Jacques de Molay, other senior Templars of heresy. After private hearings, this absolution was not proclaimed publicly. It remained confined to internal documentation. Yet 4 years later, the order was dissolved. Clement's correspondence reflects tension. He navigated pressure from Philip, who demanded condemnation. He balanced political survival against ecclesiastical authority. The dissolutions bull avoids a verdict. It suppresses the order without declaring guilt. Why? If Clement believed the Templars were innocent, why not defend them? If he believed them guilty, why absolve them? The formula by apostolic provision is legal but evasive. It ends the order as a matter of governance, not doctrine. It implies necessity without specifying crime. One possibility is political weakness. Another is strategic silence. If the charges were distorted descriptions of something real, something the church considered too complex or too dangerous to expose, public trial might have amplified what was meant to be contained. Clement dissolved the institution. He did not condemn its essence. And that distinction suggests a secret, not of corruption, but of containment. Rosslyn Chapel rises from the Scottish landscape like a manuscript carved in stone. Built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, a nobleman whose family maintained documented ties to Templar circles, the chapel is an architectural anomaly. Its walls are dense with carvings, vegetal spirals, angels, musicians, geometric knots, scenes that resist easy classification. For centuries, scholars have attempted to decode its imagery. No consensus has emerged. Officially, Rosslyn is a late Gothic chapel, an expression of aristocratic devotion. Its decorative excess can be explained as piety expressed through patronage. Medieval churches are filled with symbolic carvings, but Rosslyn exceeds familiarity. Certain figures resemble no known biblical iconography. Some carvings have been compared to Egyptian deities, human forms with stylized postures and proportions foreign to Western convention, geometric patterns, echo-proportional systems that align with Hermetic and esoteric traditions rather than standard ecclesiastical motifs. The so-called apprentice pillar incorporates spiral forms reminiscent of motifs found far from Scotland. The chapel was built more than a century after the Templars were dissolved, yet the Sinclair family appears in Templar-adjacent records. And Scotland itself offered refuge to fugitive members of the order. If fragments of Templar tradition survived, they may have survived in family networks rather than institutions. Stone is safer than parchment. If Rosslyn encodes knowledge, it does so obliquely. No inscription explains the symbols. No manual survives to interpret them. The carvings endure, but their grammar has faded. If someone intended to preserve something here, an echo of geometry, a memory of transmission, they succeeded in hiding it in plain sight. But without the key, preservation becomes obscurity. In the fortified town of Dôme in southern France, imprisoned Templars scratched marks into stone while awaiting trial. These were not commissioned artworks. They were gestures made by men uncertain of their future. The walls bear crucifixion scenes, crosses, and inscriptions typical of devotional expression. And then there are the geometric figures, circles intersecting with precise symmetry, lines crossing at measured angles, proportional constructions that suggest intention beyond idle carving. These forms are not random scratches. They resemble diagrams, exercises in geometry rendered under duress. It is possible to dismiss them as meditative distraction. A knight trained in discipline might turn to measured drawing as solace. Yet, some of these figures correspond closely to constructions common in Islamic geometric art, patterns derived from mathematical principles that trace back through Greek and possibly Egyptian sources. The men who carved them knew they might face execution. They could have inscribed prayers, final messages, names of loved ones. Instead, some chose geometry. Why? Geometry in medieval thought was not merely mathematical. It was sacred proportion, the architecture of creation. To inscribe a circle was to echo cosmology. If these carvings were messages, they were coded in form rather than language. No text accompanies them. No explanation survives. In the final days of their freedom, certain Templars turned not to confession but to construction, and the walls of Dôme still hold the lines they chose to leave behind. Freemasonry openly claims symbolic descent from the Knights Templar. The narrative is familiar. Persecuted Templars fled to Scotland, merged with stonemason guilds, and transmitted their rituals into emerging Masonic lodges. Historians largely reject direct institutional continuity. The gap between 1312 and the documented rise of speculative Freemasonry in the 17th century is too wide, the evidence too thin, yet symbols persist. Masonic ritual centers on the Temple of Solomon. It emphasizes initiation through graded degrees, symbolic death and rebirth, the moral significance of geometry. In the 18th century, Egyptian motifs enter Masonic symbolism explicitly. Obelisks, all-seeing eyes, references to ancient wisdom traditions. These could be inventions, romantic constructions layered onto an existing fraternity. Enlightenment fascination with Egypt is well documented. Myth can be manufactured, but myth rarely emerges without precedent. Even if Freemasonry fabricated its Templar genealogy, it may have drawn upon residual traditions preserved in guild culture, family lore, or regional memory. Symbols do not require institutional continuity to survive. They require repetition. If fragments of Templar practice, ritual structure, geometric emphasis, coded language, diffused into artisan networks after the suppression, they could have resurfaced centuries later in altered form. Freemasonry may not be the order reborn, but it may be an echo. And echoes imply an original sound, even if the space between them is filled with silence. The word Baphomet has resisted interpretation for centuries. Then a cipher was applied. At Bash is a Hebrew substitution code in which the first letter of the alphabet is replaced by the last, the second by the second to last, and so on. It appears in certain medieval esoteric contexts. When researchers applied at Bash to a Hebrew transliteration of Baphomet, the resulting word was Sophia, Greek for wisdom. The elegance of the solution is striking. Instead of a demonic idol, the Templars would have been venerating wisdom itself. Sophia occupies a central place in Gnostic and Hermetic traditions. She represents divine insight, the feminine principle of knowledge. In some cosmologies, Sophia descends and becomes entangled in matter, awaiting restoration through gnosis. In Hellenistic syncretism, Sophia aligns closely with Isis, Egyptian goddess of wisdom and magic. If Baphomet encoded Sophia, the inquisitors misread a cipher as blasphemy. What was interpreted as devil worship would instead signify devotion to sacred knowledge. But the solution raises new questions. Why would the Templars use a Hebrew cipher? Who taught them cryptography sophisticated enough to conceal a central symbol within their own order? And if they encoded wisdom, why conceal its name at all? The Atbash interpretation is compelling, but it assumes layers of literacy and secrecy that require explanation. If Baphomet was wisdom encrypted, then the charge of idolatry collapses into misunderstanding. And the mystery deepens because encoded wisdom suggests deliberate concealment, not accident. If the Templars carried something back from Egypt, directly or through intermediaries, it was not a single relic wrapped in cloth. The evidence points instead toward domains of knowledge distributed across disciplines that do not normally share a narrative. First, sacred geometry. To the proportional systems embedded in certain Templar-associated structures suggest familiarity with mathematical relationships that exceed simple medieval rule-of-thumb construction. The recurrence of specific ratios, solar alignments, and geometric floor plans implies intentional design rooted in cosmological symbolism. Second, finance. The order's banking innovations, letters of credit, deposit systems, trans-regional accounting, were not invented in isolation. They reflect exposure to sophisticated economic practices long established in the Eastern Mediterranean. Here, the evidence is strongest, documented in charters and ledgers. Third, navigation and cartography. The transition from Crusader maritime logistics to the exploratory achievements of the Portuguese Order of Christ suggests continuity in maritime knowledge. Portolan charts She improved reckoning methods, and Atlantic expansion did not emerge from vacuum. Fourth, Hermetic and alchemical texts. The circulation of works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus in Templar adjacent intellectual circles hints at philosophical transmission, even if direct ownership cannot be proven. Fifth, initiatory ritual structure. Confession patterns describe graded revelation and symbolic testing, consistent with mystery traditions. Sixth, cryptographic awareness. Whether through Atbash or other methods, the capacity to encode meaning suggests more than military pragmatism. None of these domains alone proves an Egyptian transfer. Together, they describe convergence, architecture, finance, navigation, ritual, text. Conventional history treats each as independent evolution. But when they align around a single order active in Egypt and the Levant for nearly 2 centuries, coincidence begins to resemble pattern. If the Templars possessed knowledge beyond conventional theology, why conceal it? Why not publish, preach, or integrate it openly into Christendom? The answer lies in the architecture of medieval power. Heresy was not an academic disagreement, it was a capital offense. The church claimed custodianship over truth, doctrinal, spiritual, cosmological. Knowledge derived from non-Christian sources was suspect by definition, especially if it suggested that divine wisdom predated or transcended ecclesiastical authority. In such a climate, integrating Egyptian-derived cosmology into Christian practice would not have been interpreted as enrichment. It would have been categorized as contamination. Secrecy yet then becomes rational. An order operating across cultural frontiers might absorb ideas pragmatically, recognizing value in geometry, mysticism, financial systems, without publicly declaring their origins. To survive institutionally, synthesis would need to remain internal, reserved for higher ranks, framed as symbolic rather than doctrinal. The moment such synthesis became visible, it would threaten the monopoly of interpretation held by bishops and theologians. Philip IV's assault on the order may have been motivated by debt and politics, but once accusations began, the Inquisition provided a mechanism to interpret secrecy as guilt. The Templar silence did not save them, and that raises a darker possibility. If the knowledge was preserved only within the institution, what happened to it when the institution was dismantled? When the Templar order was dissolved in 1312, its properties were transferred primarily to the Hospitallers. But institutions are not vessels for every kind of knowledge. Administrative assets move easily. Esoteric traditions do not. In Portugal, however, the story diverges. The Order of Christ, founded shortly after the suppression, absorbed many former Templars and inherited their lands. Institutional continuity was preserved under a new name. It was this order that later sponsored maritime exploration under Prince Henry the Navigator. If navigational or cartographic knowledge survived intact, Portugal is the most plausible repository. Scotland offers another pathway. Excommunicated King Robert the Bruce reportedly sheltered fugitive Templars, while documentation is sparse. Show Templar presence in Scotland is attested before the suppression. If ritual traditions survived, they may have filtered into Scottish confraternities or guild networks. Then there are the families, the Sinclairs, the D'Anjous, the Lusignans, lineages intertwined with Crusader and Templar history. Architectural literacy and symbolic vocabulary can survive through patronage and construction, even when institutional structures collapse. These pathways are dispersed. Portugal preserved maritime function. Scotland may have preserved ritual form, aristocratic networks, preserved symbolic language. Fragmentation ensures invisibility. If no successor possessed the whole inheritance, no single archive would reveal the full picture. Survival would mean dispersion, knowledge scattered across geography and generations. And dispersion makes reconstruction nearly impossible. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte led an army into Egypt. Officially, the campaign aimed to disrupt British trade routes. Unofficially, it carried something else: 167 scholars, engineers, artists, linguists, the savants. Their task was documentation, measurement, recovery. The resulting description de l'Egypte introduced ancient Egyptian civilization to modern Europe with unprecedented detail. Temples were sketched, hieroglyphs copied, monuments analyzed. Knowledge returned westward in systematic form. Napoleon was also a Freemason. Freemasonry, by the late 18th century, had embraced Egyptian symbolism as part of its mythic heritage. Obelisks, pyramids, references to ancient wisdom, traditions circulated within its lodges. Whether historically grounded or romantically constructed, the symbolic alignment was clear. The pattern is difficult to ignore. A European military campaign in Egypt paired with a parallel mission of intellectual acquisition. 7 centuries earlier, another military religious order had operated across the same geography. Coincidence remains possible. Yet the anecdote persists that Napoleon spent a night alone inside the Great Pyramid and emerged visibly shaken, refusing to describe what occurred. The story may be apocryphal, but its resonance is undeniable. Those who encounter Egypt directly often return changed, and sometimes they choose silence. There is a discipline to uncertainty. After following the threads through architecture, finance, ritual, and archive, it becomes necessary to separate what is anchored from what is inferred. It is documented that the Templars excavated beneath the Temple Mount during their founding years. It is documented that they maintained a sustained presence in the Levant and Egypt during the Crusades. It is documented that their architecture exhibits unusual proportional sophistication in certain contexts. It is documented that the order survived institutionally in Portugal under the name Order of Christ. These are fixed points. Strongly circumstantial evidence extends outward. Transmission through Alexandrian and Coptic intermediaries is historically plausible. The Baphomet Sophia cipher offers a coherent interpretive lens, though not proof. Parallels between Egyptian metrology and certain European constructions suggest correspondence, not confirmation. The convergence across multiple knowledge domains builds structural coherence, and then there is speculation. Direct Templar visits to Giza or Abydos remain unverified. Intentional Hermetic ritual practice cannot be demonstrated conclusively. The content of destroyed or inaccessible archives remains unknown. The interior life of the order is partially visible only through hostile transcripts. To collapse these layers into a single seamless narrative would be dishonest. The conventional account ignores anomalies. The conspiratorial account erases evidentiary boundaries. Intellectual integrity requires holding contradiction without resolving it prematurely. The truth, if recoverable, likely resides between extremes, in the space where documented fact intersects with patterned inference, but stops short of certainty. Mysteries endure not only because evidence is lost, but because evidence is inaccessible. There are specific discoveries that could, in principle, alter the landscape decisively. A comprehensive modern catalog of the Vatican's Templar holdings, cross-indexed, digitized, exhaustively published, would clarify what survives and what does not. Systematic archaeological access beneath the Temple Mount, conducted with contemporary methodology, could confirm or dismiss early excavation claims. Coptic monasteries in Upper Egypt, many still housing uncatalogued manuscripts, could reveal correspondence or marginal references linking Crusader orders to preserved texts. Portuguese state archives may yet contain navigational records from the early Order of Christ period, not fully analyzed in relation to Templar continuity. And the fragment introduced at the beginning of this investigation, its script, its measurements, its provenance, awaits decipherment. None of these are fantasies. They are physical repositories. The question is not whether evidence could exist. It is whether institutions will permit its exposure. For 700 years, the Templar archive has been mediated by authority, ecclesiastical, royal, academic. Access is granted, but selectively. Excavations are proposed, but politically constrained. The absence of proof may reflect absence of access. And if the answer is locked in parchment, sealed in stone, or buried in sand, the central mystery persists, not because it is unknowable, but because it remains unopened. Imagine the Giza Plateau as it might have appeared to a 13th century traveler, as the pyramids still partially clad in smooth casing stones, reflecting light with geometric precision. Secondary temples intact, inscriptions sharper, less weathered. The architecture not yet romantic ruin, but presence. Now place there a small contingent of Western knights, armored, foreign, heirs to a theology barely a millennium old, standing before monuments already ancient when Rome was young. They would have encountered mathematics expressed in stone, cosmology embedded in alignment, a civilization that encoded its theology in proportion rather than parchment. To confront that scale of antiquity is to feel history shift. If the Templars recognized in Egypt a lineage of sacred knowledge predating Christendom, the encounter would have been destabilizing, not a rejection of Christianity, but a widening of context, the realization that truth might be older, broader, more continuous than their institutions claimed. What does a warrior monk do with that recognition? Perhaps he encodes it, perhaps he preserves fragments within ritual and geometry, perhaps he tells no one beyond those sworn to secrecy. And perhaps the most dangerous discovery was not an artifact or a text. Perhaps it was the understanding that the sacred is older than any church, and that such knowledge cannot be contained without consequence. If that recognition occurred, it would explain the silence, not because nothing was found, but because what was found could not be safely spoken.